I'll never forget that night. It all started as just another road trip with my friends. We were traveling from New York to California, driving through the heart of the American countryside. You know, the kind of road trip where you just keep driving for hours with nothing but the hum of the engine and the occasional radio station to keep you company. We'd been on the road for almost 12 hours by the time we stopped at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. It was late, around 2 a.m., and the place was nearly deserted, save for a few scattered cars. My friend Jake pulled into the pump, and we all got out to stretch our legs and grab some snacks. The wind was unnervingly cold for such a warm summer night, and the air had that eerie stillness to it. You know, the kind where you feel like something isn't quite right but can't put your finger on it. The gas station itself was old, with flickering lights above the pumps and a worn-down convenience store inside. It looked like something out of a horror movie, and for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't be there. As I walked into the store, I saw a man standing behind the counter. He was in his late 50s, scruffy looking with a thick gray beard. He gave me a nod as I approached, but his eyes were cold, dead, almost. The kind of look that unsettles you to your core. I tried not to stare at him, but I couldn't help it. He had this unsettling aura about him, like he didn't belong there. I grabbed a bag of chips and went to the counter to pay, but something strange happened. As I was about to hand him the money, I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. There was a door to the back of the store, and for a brief second, I thought I saw someone move behind it. A quick shadow, just a glimpse. I turned my head, but there was no one there. My heart started to race, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. "Here you go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man took the money without saying a word. As I turned to leave, he suddenly spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "You kids should be careful on the road at night," he said, his tone a little too serious for my liking. "There's been strange happenings lately. You might not want to drive too far out here." I froze, turning back to look at him. He didn't seem like the type to joke around. "Strange happenings?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The man didn't answer immediately. He just stared at me, his eyes growing darker. Then he finally spoke again. "People say there's a place up the road, Old Highway 19. That's where things get weird. You won't find it on any map, but I've heard stories. People disappear, they drive up, and they never come back. Some say it's just bad luck, but I've heard things. Strange things. Ghosts, spirits, something else." I laughed nervously, thinking he was just trying to mess with me. "Yeah, okay. Thanks for the heads up," I said, trying to play it off. But the man's expression didn't change. His gaze was intense now, like he was trying to warn me about something I couldn't fully understand. I nodded awkwardly and left the store to find the others. My friends were waiting by the car, chatting and laughing as if nothing was wrong. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After a few minutes of discussion, we decided to press on. We didn't think much of the man's warning. After all, we were road tripping, just a group of young adults having fun. We were invincible, or at least, that's what we thought. We pulled back onto the highway, and the further we drove, the more the road seemed to narrow. The dark trees on either side of us seemed to close in, and the air grew heavier, thicker. The streetlights, few and far between, flickered in and out of existence. I kept glancing at the GPS, but it seemed like the map was slowly becoming more distorted. The little blip representing our car began to shift, moving further from the roads that should have been there. It felt like we were entering a different world. "Do you guys see that?" I asked, my voice a little shaky. "The map's messed up. We shouldn't be out here." Jake laughed it off. "It's probably just a glitch. GPSs are like that sometimes. We'll be fine." But as we drove deeper into the night, the landscape began to look less familiar. The road was winding now, with no signs, no markers, just endless trees. I started to feel a rising sense of dread, the kind of gut feeling that something was terribly wrong. "Let's turn back," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't feel good about this." But no one listened. They were all too caught up in the thrill of the trip, and then, out of nowhere, the car engine started sputtering. A loud pop echoed through the night, and the headlights flickered before shutting off completely. "What the hell?" Jake yelled, slamming his hands against the steering wheel. "Not now, come on!" We pulled over to the side of the road, the engine now completely dead. The eerie silence that surrounded us was suffocating. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees in a way that almost sounded like whispers. "We need to check the engine," said Jake, getting out of the car. The others followed suit, and I stayed behind in the car, locking the doors and clutching my phone. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere, on a road that didn't seem to lead to anything. The air was colder than before, and I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Off in the distance, far beyond the reach of the headlights, there was a figure standing by the side of the road. A tall, thin figure with a long, flowing coat. "Hey, do you guys see that?" I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. Jake and the others turned to look, but by the time they did, the figure was gone, vanished into the darkness like it had never been there. "I don't like this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here now." Jake was already heading back to the car, his face pale. "The engine's fried. We're not going anywhere anytime soon. We're stuck here." A sinking feeling filled my stomach. We were trapped. Then, the whispering began. It started off faint, like the wind was carrying voices, but it grew louder and louder. The sound seemed to come from all directions, and I could swear I heard my name being called. "Jess." I froze. It was my voice, but it wasn't me. It was as though something else was calling me. "Jess." I could feel something watching me from the darkness, something out there in the trees. My breath quickened, and I could hear my friends behind me talking nervously, trying to stay calm. But I couldn't take it anymore. "Let's go," I shouted, my voice breaking. "We need to leave now." Without waiting for a response, I threw open the door and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away from that cursed road. I ran and ran, the sounds of my friends' voices fading behind me, replaced by that dreadful whispering. The figure was there again, standing just at the edge of the trees, watching me. Its eyes, those empty, black eyes, pierced through the darkness. I stumbled and fell, gasping for air, but when I looked up, the figure was gone. The whispering stopped. I didn't know how long I'd been running, but when I finally stopped and looked around, I found myself standing on a different road. The trees had given way to open fields, and the familiar highway was nowhere in sight. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but then the realization hit me. My friends were still out there. I had left them behind. I turned to go back, but there was nothing but silence. Scared yet? Subscribe for more tales from the dark side that'll send shivers down your spine.
Next story.
I was on a road trip heading cross-country for what was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. I had my music blasting through the speakers, my bags packed in the back, and a map with my planned route outlined. But the highway I took ended up taking me somewhere far darker. It was late, well past midnight, and I was driving through a stretch of road in rural Wyoming. The only light came from the headlights of my car, cutting through the thick, black night. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. My eyes were growing heavy, and the pull of exhaustion was starting to get the better of me. I had thought about stopping for a rest at a motel or diner, but the small towns I'd passed earlier looked deserted, and I didn't want to risk ending up somewhere even more remote. I should have listened to that voice in the back of my head, but I didn't. I kept driving. At some point, the road began to twist and turn, winding deeper into the mountains. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the air felt thicker. My car's engine rumbled uneasily, as if it, too, knew something wasn't right. That's when I first saw it, a figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a trick of my tired eyes or maybe an animal, but no, it was a woman. She was pale, with long, disheveled black hair hanging down around her face. She was wearing a tattered white dress, the kind you'd expect to see on someone who had been lost in the wilderness for days. I slowed down as I neared her, my hand instinctively gripping the steering wheel tighter. Her face remained hidden beneath the veil of her hair, but I could see her eyes glinting in the darkness. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to stop and offer her help, but I had no idea what was going on. My mind raced with every possibility, each one worse than the last. What if she was some kind of ghost, some lost soul haunting this lonely stretch of road? But then I thought about the dangers of picking up strangers in the middle of nowhere. What if she wasn't alone? What if this was some kind of trap? So I did what anyone would do in that situation. I sped up and drove past her, trying not to look in the rearview mirror. I wasn't about to risk anything, ghost or not. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me because of how tired I was. But as I continued on, the unsettling feeling in my gut didn't go away. It grew, gnawing at me. Then came the phone call. My phone, which had been silent for the past few hours, suddenly buzzed in my pocket. I glanced down at the screen and saw an unknown number flashing. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something made me pick up. "Hello?" I asked, trying to mask the unease in my voice. The line was silent for a long moment before a voice crackled through. It sounded distant and faint, almost like the voice was coming from the other side of a tunnel. "Help me," the voice whispered. It was barely audible, but the words chilled me to the bone. "Help me," the voice repeated, as if it was speaking directly to me. I thought I was hearing things. Maybe I was just too tired. Maybe it was just the weird phone signal on these back roads, but something about it felt too real. "Who is this?" I asked, my hand trembling as I held the phone to my ear. "I'm lost," the voice whispered again, weaker this time. "Come back for me, please." That was when I heard something else. A soft rustling sound, like a dress dragging against the gravel road. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't alone. I looked out my car window, but there was nothing there, just the pitch-black night stretching on in every direction. The only light came from my headlights, casting long shadows across the road. My grip tightened around the wheel as I sped up. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. The voice continued to plead with me, growing fainter as I drove away, but that rustling sound, it wouldn't leave. It felt like it was right outside my car, but whenever I looked, no one was there. Then came the next strange occurrence. My car's engine sputtered. It wasn't a big deal at first, just a quick hiccup. I figured it was the cold or maybe some kind of electrical glitch, but as the seconds ticked by, the sputtering grew worse. The engine began to cough and groan, the car slowing down despite my foot being firmly on the accelerator. The lights flickered. I pulled over, cursing under my breath. This was the last thing I needed. I tried turning the engine off and on again, hoping it was just a temporary glitch. But when I stepped out of the car to inspect the engine, that's when I heard it. The soft sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one there, just the same empty stretch of road and the stillness of the night. But I could feel it. Something was watching me. Something was waiting. I hurried back into the car, heart racing, and slammed the door shut behind me. The engine miraculously roared back to life when I turned the key again, but I wasn't about to stay there any longer. I sped off, the car shaking beneath me as I hit the gas. But no matter how fast I drove, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that woman on the side of the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The phone rang again. I didn't want to answer. I knew what was on the other side of that call, but I couldn't stop myself. I picked up the phone. "Why didn't you help me?" The voice whispered, the same voice from earlier. But this time it was different. It sounded distorted, almost inhuman, like the air itself had twisted it. The rustling grew louder, filling the car with a terrible presence. I felt it pressing in on me from all sides. "Why didn't you come back?" the voice hissed. Before I could respond, the call disconnected, the line going dead. I was driving faster than I ever had in my life, my hands sweating on the steering wheel, eyes darting from the road to the rearview mirror. I kept expecting to see that figure, that woman in the distance, or worse, right behind me. But there was nothing. No figure, no woman in a white dress, only the endless road stretching into the void. And yet, despite the silence, the cold dread never left me. It clung to me like a second skin, wrapping around me, suffocating me. I eventually made it to the nearest town, my hands shaking as I pulled into a gas station. The attendant barely looked up from the counter when I rushed inside to pay for gas. "Everything okay?" he asked, noticing the wild look in my eyes. I think I saw something," I stammered. "Back on the road, a woman. I heard voices." He just nodded, his face expressionless. "The road's haunted," he said flatly. "Everyone knows it. You're not the first to see her." I froze. "The woman in white," he continued, his voice barely a whisper now. "She's been seen out there for years. They say she's the ghost of a hitchhiker who was murdered on that stretch of road long ago. They say she's still out there looking for someone to take her home. I didn't know what to say. I had no words for it. It was a story I would never forget, one that would haunt me long after that night. I left that gas station without saying another word, trying to ignore the feeling that someone was still following me. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the thought that I hadn't really escaped. The woman was still out there, waiting, watching. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to subscribe and be a part of our haunting journey.
Next story.
I had never been one to believe in anything supernatural. Ghosts, spirits, curses. Those were things you read about in books, watched in movies, or heard about in campfire stories. I always prided myself on being a rational person, someone who could explain everything with logic and reason. But all of that changed on a road trip I took last year, one that I'll never forget, no matter how hard I try. It started like any other road trip. I was driving across the state, headed to a small town where my cousin was getting married. I decided to take the back roads to avoid traffic and enjoy the quiet of the countryside. I was alone, just me and my trusty old sedan, cruising along an empty, winding road that seemed to stretch endlessly through farmland and woods. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, when I passed a small sign that caught my eye. It was old and weathered. The letters almost faded beyond recognition. It read, "Welcome to Black Hollow, a historic town." I thought nothing of it at first, but then I glanced at the clock. I still had a long way to go, and I wasn't sure I wanted to keep driving in the dark. It wasn't that late, but the thought of finding a small town to stop in and grab a bite to eat seemed like a good idea. So, I took the next turn and followed the road into Black Hollow. At first, the town seemed quaint, if not a little bit eerie. It was small, one main street with a few buildings on either side. The architecture was old, with wooden storefronts and Victorian-style houses. It had a certain charm to it, but there was an unsettling quiet that hung in the air. No people in sight, no cars parked along the street, not a single sign of life, just empty buildings, their windows dark. I pulled into what looked like a small diner on the corner. The neon sign buzzed faintly, and the door creaked as I pushed it open. The smell of grease and coffee hit me immediately, but the place was strangely empty. The only person inside was an older woman sitting at the counter, staring blankly into her coffee cup. I took a seat at the far end of the counter, and the woman's eyes flickered up to meet mine. Her face was pale, her features gaunt, like she hadn't slept in days. She didn't smile. Instead, she simply nodded and muttered, "You're passing through?" I nodded, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that was creeping over me. "Yeah, just stopping for a bite. Looks like a nice town." She stared at me for a long moment, and then her lips parted, but she didn't speak. It was as if she was about to say something, but then changed her mind. Finally, she gestured to the menu and said, "What can I get ya?" I ordered something simple, a burger and fries, and sat back, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The town felt off, like it was stuck in time. I had passed through countless small towns in my life, but this one was different. The air was thick with a sense of history, as if it had witnessed too much over the years and was now holding its secrets close. The woman slid my plate across the counter without a word. I thanked her and dug in, but the food tasted bland, almost stale. Still, I ate it, figuring I'd need the energy for the long drive ahead. When I finished, I paid and stood up, ready to leave. But as I did, the woman spoke again. "You'll be safe, as long as you don't go down to the end of Main Street," she said in a low voice. I froze, my hand still on my wallet. "What do you mean?" She looked around nervously, then leaned in closer, lowering her voice even further. "Don't go past the old church at the end of town. Don't ask questions, just turn around and go back the way you came." I stared at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. There was something in her eyes, a kind of fear that made me hesitate, but I couldn't quite understand it. "Why?" I asked, though a part of me already knew I shouldn't have. She didn't answer. Instead, she simply got up, walked to the back, and disappeared into the kitchen. I stood there for a moment, feeling like I had crossed into some sort of strange, forgotten world. But then, I shook it off. Small towns were often full of quirks and oddities. Maybe the woman was just eccentric. Maybe she was just lonely, talking to passing strangers for some kind of comfort. I decided to continue on my way. I stepped back outside into the fading light and got into my car. The town felt even quieter now, if that was possible. As I drove toward the end of Main Street, I couldn't help but look down at the old church she had mentioned. It was a massive, Gothic-style building with a tall, crumbling steeple. The windows were boarded up, and the front door was ajar, as if waiting for someone to enter. Something about it called to me, but I fought the urge to go any further. I remembered the woman's warning and turned the car around, just as she had suggested. But as I started to drive back, I noticed something strange. The road ahead was different. The trees on the side of the road seemed to have grown taller, their branches stretching out over the street like a canopy. The buildings on either side of the street looked older now, more rundown, as if they had deteriorated since I had passed by them minutes earlier. I turned around again, hoping to head out of town, but the road had shifted. I didn't recognize the intersection. The street signs were gone, replaced by faded, illegible markers. The town had changed. It felt darker, colder. And the strangest part, there was no sound, not even the hum of my car's engine. The air was suffocating, and I had the distinct feeling that I was being watched. My heart began to race as I realized I couldn't find my way out. I drove in circles for what seemed like hours. Every turn led to the same empty street, the same boarded-up buildings, the same church looming in the distance. The fog was creeping in now, rolling across the ground like a blanket, and the temperature dropped sharply. Suddenly, I saw something. A shadow. A figure standing in the middle of the street, blocking my path. I slammed on the brakes and skidded to a stop. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like a tattered black coat. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning into my soul. The figure didn't move, but I felt an overwhelming urge to turn the car around and get out of there. Anywhere but here. I put the car in reverse and sped off, not daring to look back. I drove through the streets, but they all looked the same, a maze with no exit. Finally, I saw the sign again, the sign that read, "Welcome to Black Hollow." Only now it was different. The words were cracked and faded, and the town beyond it looked like something out of a nightmare. Shadows and fog, twisted shapes in the distance, and nothing else. I couldn't take it anymore. I floored the accelerator, not caring about the road or the signs anymore. I just needed to get away. And somehow, after what felt like an eternity, the fog started to clear and the road opened up. I found myself back on a normal highway, the bright lights of a distant town visible on the horizon. I never went back to Black Hollow. I've driven through that area many times since, but I never found the town again. Sometimes, though, when I'm alone on a long drive, I'll see a faded sign out of the corner of my eye, and I'll wonder, did I ever really leave? Was Black Hollow just a dream, or was it something far worse? Don't miss out on more hauntingly good stories. Subscribe now.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, nothing more than a simple road trip to clear my head. I had recently gone through a rough patch, dealing with a breakup and the endless grind of city life. A friend recommended a remote, peaceful retreat by a quiet lake, far from the distractions of the world. The idea of getting away from everything sounded perfect, so I packed my bags, grabbed some snacks, and set off alone. I was excited as I left the busy streets of the city behind, the traffic and noise replaced by the winding country roads and the hum of my car. The drive itself was beautiful. The landscape unfolded before me, vast open fields and dense forests stretching out as far as the eye could see. I passed a few small towns, but other than that, I felt like I had the whole world to myself. It was a couple of hours before sunset when I realized something wasn't quite right. The road had become narrower, twisting and turning, and the GPS signal had cut out a while ago. My phone had no reception either. At first, I wasn't concerned. The route to the cabin was supposed to be off the beaten path, so it made sense that the signal would drop. But as the minutes passed, I began to feel an uneasy sense of isolation. I'd been driving for what felt like forever when I finally saw the turnoff, an unmarked dirt road that led into the woods. There were no signs indicating a cabin or a lake, just a rough path with overgrown vegetation. I hesitated for a moment, but decided to go for it. After all, this was supposed to be a peaceful escape. Maybe a bit of adventure wouldn't hurt. I took the turn, the car bouncing over the uneven ground. The road was barely wide enough for my car, the trees hanging low on either side, their branches scraping against the windows. The further I went, the thicker the woods became. It felt like I was driving deeper into some forgotten part of the world. The sun had nearly set, and the shadows of the trees grew longer, swallowing the last light of the day. As I continued, a sudden chill filled the air, sending a shiver down my spine. I glanced at the temperature gauge. It had dropped quickly. I pressed on, telling myself it was nothing more than the natural coolness of the evening air. Then I saw it. A small clearing up ahead, just beyond the trees. In the middle of the clearing stood an old, weathered house. It wasn't the charming, cozy cabin I was expecting. It looked abandoned, run down, with peeling paint and dark, empty windows that stared back at me like hollow eyes. The kind of house you see in horror movies where the characters always make the mistake of stepping inside. I slowed the car as I approached. The house seemed out of place in the middle of nowhere, its sheer desolation unnerving. But I had no choice. The road ahead was blocked by fallen branches, and this was the only place I could stop. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, staring at the house. I wondered if I had made a mistake coming this far, but there was something about the place that pulled me in, some inexplicable curiosity. I grabbed my bag and stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound in the still air. The moment I took my first step toward the house, I felt a wave of unease wash over me. The air was thick with an odd stillness, and the silence felt too heavy, like it was suffocating me. As I got closer, I noticed the front door was ajar, the wood creaking slightly in the wind. I stood there for a moment, considering my options. Maybe I was being foolish, but the cabin was only a few more miles up the road, and I could tell from the look of the place that no one had lived here for years. I'd just take a quick look inside, get some photos, and leave. What harm could it do? I pushed the door open. The interior was dim, the air stale and musty. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. A thick layer of dust covered everything. It looked like no one had been here in decades, if not longer. I started to move through the house, snapping a few pictures on my phone. There was something oddly captivating about the place, the way the light filtered through the grimy windows, casting long shadows across the rooms. I made my way toward the staircase that led to the second floor. As I reached the bottom step, something made me pause. A faint noise, a creaking like footsteps, but no one else was there. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. It was probably just the house settling. The wind outside had picked up, and the old structure was probably reacting to the gusts. I kept climbing, my footsteps echoing in the quiet space. When I reached the top, I turned down the hallway. The door to the first bedroom was cracked open. I approached cautiously, not sure why my instincts were suddenly on high alert. My hand reached for the knob, and I turned it slowly. Inside, the room was empty, but the bed had fresh sheets on it. Immaculate, almost too perfect for a house that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I stepped further in, my curiosity piqued. The room felt off, like it was waiting for something. And then I noticed it, the mirror on the far wall. At first, it seemed like an ordinary mirror, but something about it caught my attention. It wasn't reflecting the room the way it should have. It was as if it were showing a different space altogether, another version of the room, but with one subtle difference. In the reflection, there was a figure standing behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. I stared back at the mirror, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was still there, standing just over my shoulder. A woman dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her face obscured by a veil. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off the mirror. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. My mind raced. Was it a trick of the light? Was it my imagination? But no. I could feel the presence, like I was being watched. I didn't waste another second. I turned and bolted for the stairs, almost tripping as I rushed down them. My heart was pounding in my chest, my thoughts a jumble of panic and confusion. I reached the front door, but as my hand reached for the handle, I froze. The door was shut. I tugged at it, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like something was holding it shut. My breath quickened. I could hear something behind me, faint, like the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty house. The silence was deafening. I felt a hand brush against my shoulder. I screamed, the sound sharp and raw as I turned and yanked open the door with all my strength. The moment I stepped outside, the pressure on my chest lifted. The air felt lighter, as if I had just escaped something dark and suffocating. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I ran to my car, jumped in, and sped off, the tires kicking up dirt as I raced down the narrow road. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and my hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, too shaken to even think about continued trip to the cabin by the lake. As I pulled into a gas station, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. I don't know what happened back there or what I saw in that house, but I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to find it, and I sure as hell won't ever go back. Are you hooked on these spine-tingling stories? Subscribe to get more and never miss a scary moment.
Next story.
I was on a solo road trip, just me and my old Ford Mustang, cruising through the back roads of rural America. It was the beginning of October, and the air was crisp with that early fall chill. The sun had just started to dip beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across the highway. I had been on the road for hours, far from any major city, and the quiet emptiness of the vast, open country was both peaceful and eerie. I had no specific destination in mind, just driving, getting away from the noise of the city, the pressure of work, and the weight of responsibilities. I wanted to experience the freedom of the open road. Little did I know, the freedom would come at a terrifying cost. As I was cruising through a particularly desolate stretch of highway, my car's engines suddenly sputtered, jolting me forward. I had always taken good care of my car, so it wasn't the kind of issue I was expecting. I pulled over to the side of the road, hoping it was just a minor glitch that would fix itself. But when I tried to restart the engine, there was nothing. No sound. I turned the key again. Still nothing. The engine was completely dead. Panic started to creep in as I looked around. The highway was isolated, not another car in sight. No houses or buildings, just miles of empty farmland on both sides of the road. I had no cell signal, of course, no surprise there considering the area. I stepped out of the car to assess the situation, my breath visible in the cool air. I popped the hood, but everything seemed fine at first glance. Maybe it was just the battery, I thought. I checked my phone again, still no signal. I debated walking down the road, hoping to find a farmhouse or some kind of help, but then I heard something. It was a faint sound at first, almost like a soft whistling in the distance. I turned my head, squinting into the fading twilight. It was coming from the tree line just off the road. I couldn't make it out, but it sounded strange, almost like a voice. I shook my head, trying to brush it off. Probably just the wind. I glanced at the dashboard again, checking for anything out of the ordinary. And that's when I noticed it. A figure standing by the side of the road. It was hard to make out at first, just a silhouette against the darkening sky. But as I squinted, I could see it more clearly. A man, tall and thin, wearing a ragged coat that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were the most unsettling part. They were wide open, staring directly at me, unblinking. I froze, unsure of what to do. Should I go back to the car? Should I approach him? My instincts screamed to stay in the car, but curiosity pulled me toward him. I took a hesitant step forward. "Hey," I called out, trying to sound confident. "Are you okay?" The man didn't answer. He just continued to stare at me with those wide, vacant eyes. His mouth opened slightly, and I could hear a low, raspy whisper. It wasn't words, but more like a gurgling sound, like something was trapped in his throat. "Hello?" I called again, stepping closer. But before I could reach him, the man slowly began to move backward, his movements jerky and unnatural, like he was being pulled away. And then, he vanished. 1 second, he was there, and the next, there was nothing but empty space. The air was dead quiet now, no whispering wind, no sounds of life. I stood there for a moment, dumbfounded, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. My heart was pounding in my chest. I turned back to my car, my legs trembling. I didn't know what was worse, the eerie silence or the thought that I wasn't alone. I rushed back to my car, fumbling for my keys. But when I tried to start the engine again, it came to life. The sound of the engine roaring to life sent a brief wave of relief through me. I slammed the car into gear and floored the accelerator, speeding down the road as fast as I could. But the unease lingered. I didn't know what I had seen. It could have been a hallucination, some kind of trick of the light. But the longer I drove, the more I felt the weight of it, the tension in the air. Something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, followed. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, but the further I drove, the more unsettling the surroundings became. The trees on either side of the highway appeared to be closing in, their dark branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The sky overhead had grown thick with clouds, blotting out the stars. The road was empty, silent, but it didn't feel empty. It felt wrong. And then as I passed a bend in the road, I saw it. A sign. Old and weathered, the letters faded from years of exposure to the elements. Welcome to Widow's Hollow. The name sent a chill down my spine, and I felt my stomach turn. There was something about the sign that felt off. It felt like it had been placed there for a reason. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was just as dark and desolate as ever. But something was different. Something was moving. A shadow. I tried to push the thoughts out of my head, but they wouldn't go away. I pressed on the gas, trying to outrun whatever was following me, but the sense of dread only deepened. I could feel the temperature drop, and my breath became visible in the cold air of the car. A strange fog began to roll in, thick and white, obscuring the road ahead. It was like the world was closing in around me. And then, just as I was about to pass a dilapidated farmhouse, I saw her. A woman standing in the middle of the road, her back to me. She was wearing a long, flowing white dress, and her hair was long and black, cascading down her back. She didn't move. She didn't even acknowledge the sound of my car approaching. I slammed my foot on the brake, my heart racing. The car screeched to a halt just inches from her, and I watched in horror as she slowly turned around. Her face was pale, almost corpse-like, and her eyes were wide, vacant, just like the man I had seen earlier. "Please," I whispered, my voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" The woman said nothing. She just stared at me, her eyes unblinking, unseeing. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The only sound was the faintest whisper of a voice, the same raspy, gurgling sound I had heard before. I didn't wait to hear more. I slammed the car into reverse and sped backward, my hands trembling as I struggled to keep control of the vehicle. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what was behind me. I just kept driving, faster and faster, until the fog began to lift and the road cleared. Eventually, the town faded behind me, and I found myself back on a more familiar highway. The feeling of being watched, of being pursued, didn't leave me. It clung to me as if something was still following me, just out of sight. I don't know what I saw that night, whether it was a haunting, a twisted trick of the mind, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing. Widow's Hollow isn't just a place on a map. It's a place you don't want to visit, no matter how long the road seems, and it's a place that once you've been to, you can never quite leave. Enjoyed this story? Make sure to subscribe for your next terrifying tale.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a simple trip. I was driving through the Midwest, taking the long way home to avoid the highway traffic. A scenic route, one that would take me through small towns and quiet roads. I'd always loved the peace of the countryside, the way the world felt like it slowed down, and I thought this drive would be the perfect way to unwind after a stressful few weeks. But as I drove deeper into the heart of nowhere, I began to wish I had taken the faster route. It started with the weather. I had noticed the clouds rolling in as the sun began to dip lower on the horizon. By the time I passed the last town, it was already twilight, and the sky had taken on a menacing gray hue. I should have stopped then, found a motel to stay the night, but I didn't. I was determined to make it to my destination. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for one car, and there was no streetlight in sight. The only illumination came from my headlights, casting long, eerie shadows across the road ahead. The air had grown unnaturally still, and I felt like something was watching me from the thick forest on either side of the road. I kept driving, hoping to find a town or at least a sign that I wasn't completely alone out here. But as the minutes stretched into hours, I realized something strange. I hadn't seen another car for a while. Not one. Not even a passing vehicle. It felt like I was in the middle of nowhere, and the isolation began to gnaw at me. That's when I saw the sign. It was a weathered wooden board nailed to a post, the words barely legible in the dim light. I leaned forward, squinting to read it. Hollow Creek, 5 miles. Hollow Creek. The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. I had never heard of the town, but it was the only sign of civilization for miles, so I decided to keep going. As I drove on, the wind picked up and the temperature seemed to drop. I had to turn on my headlights full beam to cut through the growing fog. The road twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, narrowing into sharp curves and dead ends that led nowhere. I glanced at my GPS, and it had stopped working, the screen freezing on a single point, no longer showing my route. Panic began to set in. I was lost. I had no idea where I was, and something about the place felt wrong. But then, just ahead, I saw a faint glow in the distance. It looked like a light, perhaps a street lamp, and I felt a surge of relief. A town, a sign of life. I sped up, desperate for a sense of normalcy. As I neared, the light grew brighter, and I could make out shapes in the fog. Buildings, old, crumbling buildings, lined the street. There was no one outside, no movement at all. But the street lamp flickered in the wind, casting a weak, yellow light over the scene. I pulled into the town, but something about it felt wrong. The buildings were run down, their windows dark and shattered. The streets were empty, and the silence was suffocating. Not a single soul in sight. I slowed down and pulled up to a small gas station. It looked abandoned, but there was a sign above the door. Hollow Creek, 24 hours. It didn't make sense. If the place was open 24 hours, where were the people? Where were the cars? I got out of the car, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I walked up to the door and tried the handle. Locked. I knocked, but there was no answer. I was about to give up and get back in the car when I heard a sound behind me. Footsteps. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. Just the wind rustling through the trees. I felt my heart rate spike and my skin prickled. It was like I wasn't alone, but every time I looked around, there was nothing. I hurried back to my car, but just as I was about to open the door, I heard it again. Footsteps, much closer this time. I spun around and froze. A figure stood at the edge of the street just outside the circle of light from the street lamp. At first, I couldn't make out any details. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadow, its face hidden. But I could feel it watching me, its presence like a weight pressing on my chest. "Hey," I called, my voice shaky. "Can I help you?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there unmoving. I took a step back, my heart thudding in my chest. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice rising in panic. "What do you want?" The figure still didn't move, but I noticed something strange. Its shadow stretched unnaturally long, like it was reaching for me. I backed away even further, my eyes never leaving the figure. The air around me felt charged, thick with something I couldn't name. That's when I heard it. A voice. Low, guttural, like it came from deep within the earth. It was a whisper, a slow, deliberate whisper. "Get out!" I didn't need to hear anything more. I turned and ran back to my car, jumped in, and slammed the door shut. My hands shook as I started the engine, and I didn't look back as I peeled out of there, tires screeching on the empty road. As I drove away, the fog thickened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. My headlights illuminated the road ahead, but it felt like I was being pulled back to that town, to Hollow Creek. Every twist and turn felt like the road was closing in around me, and the gas gauge on my dashboard was slowly creeping toward empty. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a sign in the distance. "Welcome to Oak Ridge." I didn't care where I was, just as long as I was out of Hollow Creek. I pulled into a gas station just outside of town, my hands still trembling. I filled up my tank quickly and walked inside to pay. The attendant, a middle-aged man with graying hair, looked up from his paper when I entered. "Long night?" he asked, his voice friendly enough. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You wouldn't happen to know where Hollow Creek is, would you?" The man's face changed. His smile faded, and he looked at me with a strange expression. "Hollow Creek?" he repeated slowly, his voice tight. "No one's been there in years." I blinked. "What do you mean?" "I just came through there. I saw it. It's real." The man's eyes darkened. Hollow Creek doesn't exist anymore. People used to live there, but, well, they say it's cursed. Nothing good ever came out of that place. I was silent, trying to process what he was saying. "You should be careful driving around these parts," the man said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Some places you pass through, they don't always stay where they're supposed to." I nodded, still in shock, and paid for my gas. I didn't say another word as I left the station. But I couldn't shake what he had said. The town had felt too real. The people, if they were people, too solid, too close. I never went back to that road, and I never saw Hollow Creek again. But sometimes, when I drive down an empty stretch of highway, I wonder, what if that place is still out there, waiting for the next lost soul to wander through? Don't let these tales of terror end here. Subscribe for more and join our haunted family.
Next story.
I had always loved road trips. The feeling of freedom that comes with the open road, the endless possibilities ahead, it was exhilarating. So when my friends invited me to join them for a weekend getaway, I didn't hesitate. We were headed upstate to a secluded cabin in the woods, far away from the hustle and bustle of the city. It sounded like the perfect escape, and honestly, I was looking forward to the adventure. The drive there was picturesque at first. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue across the trees and the winding roads. We had a few laughs, blasting music, playing games, and joking about the random things you only discuss on long drives. But as we got deeper into the woods, the mood shifted. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in around us, their twisted branches blocking the last bits of sunlight. The GPS, which had been guiding us fine for hours, suddenly lost signal. It was strange, but we were in the middle of nowhere, so we figured it was just the location. We kept driving, assuming we were close to the cabin. We had all agreed that we'd take a shortcut to save time, and I didn't think anything of it. It wasn't until the road became less of a road and more of a narrow, almost forgotten trail that we started to feel uneasy. The trees were so dense now, their branches reaching out like they wanted to grab us, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves under the tires. "Maybe we should turn around," suggested Emily from the back seat, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "This doesn't feel right." But we pressed on, laughing it off as we continued down the bumpy, uneven path. We were only a few miles away from our destination, and I was determined to make it there. The air inside the car was thick with tension, but I convinced everyone to ignore it. The final stretch of the road was the creepiest. We turned a sharp corner, and there it was, a massive old house at the end of the path. It was dark, its silhouette barely visible against the darkened sky. The windows were cracked, and the wood was rotting. The house had an abandoned, eerie look to it, but it was the only structure for miles. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Guys?" I said, my voice faltering. "I thought the cabin was supposed to be smaller and newer." "Maybe this is just an old farmhouse or something," Jake replied. He was the least superstitious of all of us, so when he shrugged it off, we all did the same. We parked the car and got out, the cold air hitting us immediately. The front porch creaked as we made our way up, and I couldn't help but notice the faded, peeling paint. The house didn't look like it had been lived in for years. "Hello?" I called out, knocking on the door. No response. "Well, it's definitely abandoned," Emily said, nervously glancing at the overgrown yard. We decided to go inside, figuring we could at least check it out before deciding what to do next. The front door creaked open on its own as if it had been waiting for us. The inside was dark, musty, and cold. The smell of mildew hit us immediately, but we ventured deeper inside anyway. The first room was what appeared to be an old parlor. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the furniture was covered in dusty white sheets. The only thing that stood out was an old grandfather clock in the corner, its pendulum swaying back and forth, even though there was no one around to move it. We ventured further into the house, but with every step, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The air was thick with a sense of dread, like we were walking through a place that didn't want us there. "Let's just leave," Emily said, her voice shaky now. "I don't like this." But before I could respond, we heard a noise, a creaking sound like something moving upstairs. We froze. I turned to look at my friends, but they were just as scared as I was. "Did you hear that?" Jake whispered. "Yeah," I said, my heart racing. Maybe it's just an animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The noise was too deliberate, too human. We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, one of the upstairs doors creaked open. We all jumped at the sound, and for a moment I was paralyzed by fear. Maybe we should check it out, Jake said, trying to sound brave. We came all this way. Might as well see what's up there. I didn't want to, but I also didn't want to look like the scared one. So, against every instinct I had, I nodded. We began to slowly climb the stairs, the wood creaking under each step as if the house was groaning beneath our weight. At the top of the stairs, there was a hallway with several closed doors. The creaking noise had stopped, and the house was eerily silent again. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone here?" No answer. We cautiously approached the first door. Jake turned the knob and slowly pushed it open. Inside was a bedroom, old, dusty, with a bed that looked like it hadn't been slept in for decades. But it was the walls that caught my attention. They were covered in strange symbols, carved into the wood like they had been etched there by someone or something. I felt my skin crawl as I recognized some of the shapes. Symbols from old occult books, the kind you read about but never want to see in person. "Okay, this is too much," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here. Now." We turned to leave, but as soon as we stepped back into the hallway, the door slammed shut behind us. We jumped, hearts pounding in our chests. Then I saw it, a shadow moving at the end of the hallway just outside of our sight. It was tall and thin, but its movements were jerky, almost unnatural. Without thinking, we turned and bolted down the stairs, our footsteps thundering in the silence. But when we reached the front door, it wouldn't open. The handle rattled, but the door was stuck, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. I screamed in panic and began pounding on the door. "Let us out! Please!" Suddenly the lights flickered, and for a split second, I saw it. The figure from the hallway. It was standing right behind us, its pale, twisted face grinning at us in the darkness. I turned to face it, but before I could scream again, the door finally swung open and we rushed outside, not stopping to look back. We ran to the car, jumped inside, and sped off, not daring to glance at the house in the rearview mirror. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town. We were shaken, silent, too terrified to speak. I don't know what that house was or what we encountered in it, but one thing is certain: we were never meant to find it. And I'm sure it doesn't want anyone to leave. Want more spine-chilling stories? Hit the subscribe button now.
Next story.
I had never believed in ghosts. I always thought it was all just stories. Old folklore passed down through generations, designed to spook you in the dark. That was until I found myself on a road trip through the backwoods of Tennessee. I was on my way to a cabin my friend had rented for the weekend, and I figured a solitary drive through some rural roads would be a great way to clear my mind. It was a sunny afternoon when I started my journey, but as the miles went by, the sun began to set, and the light faded quickly. The GPS told me I had about an hour and a half left until I reached my destination, so I wasn't too worried about the dark. But something about the isolation of the winding road unsettled me. No cars, no houses, just trees on either side for miles. It felt like I was in another world, one that hadn't changed in centuries. I came around a bend, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the fading light, a mirage maybe, but there, in the middle of the road, stood an old man. He looked out of place, with his long white beard, tattered clothes, and a slow, deliberate gait. I slammed on the brakes, nearly skidding to a stop. I rolled down my window and called out to him. "Hey, are you all right?" The man didn't answer. He just kept walking toward me, his steps slow but unwavering. His eyes were wide and glassy, and there was something about his gaze that made me feel uneasy, like he was staring through me rather than at me. I felt a strange chill, and for the first time in my life, I questioned whether I should just keep driving. But I couldn't leave him there, especially not on such a desolate road. So I put the car in park and stepped out, despite my better judgment. "Sir, do you need help?" I asked, now standing a few feet from him. He didn't speak. Instead, he raised his hand slowly, pointing down the road ahead of us. I followed his finger, expecting to see something, but there was nothing. Just more empty road winding into the dark. "Is there something down there?" I asked, trying to understand. His lips parted, but only a hoarse whisper escaped. "Don't go." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "What do you mean? Don't go where?" The man's gaze flickered toward my car and then back down the road. He took a step closer to me, and I instinctively took a step back. His voice dropped to a whisper, almost drowned out by the wind. "Don't go past the church." "Church?" I echoed. He nodded and then turned, walking away, but as he did, he seemed to dissolve into the surrounding shadows, like his body was swallowed by the night. I blinked, and just like that, he was gone. I didn't know what to think. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt a wave of unease flood over me. But I told myself it was just an old man, maybe a hermit, or someone who had been lost for too long. Maybe he had seen too many things. I got back in my car, my hands shaking as I put it into drive. But that moment stayed with me, his warning, his eyes. Something about it didn't sit right. I needed to get to that cabin. I needed to just get there and put the unsettling encounter behind me. But as I drove on, something strange happened. The road seemed to stretch on forever. I glanced at my GPS. I should have been much closer to my destination, but the map showed the same stretch of winding road, looping back on itself. I had passed a small church, a quaint, weathered building with a tall spire and a faded sign out front. It looked so out of place, like it had been untouched by time. The windows were dark, no lights flickered inside. That was when I remembered the old man's warning. Don't go past the church. I slowed the car down, pulling to the side of the road as I thought about what to do. A strange feeling had settled over me. I could feel it in the air. There was a heaviness around me, and the silence, it was like the world had stopped moving. Even the wind had died down. I glanced at the church again, trying to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. But when I looked up, my breath caught in my throat. A figure stood in the doorway of the church, staring at me. I could barely make out the details, but I could see a dark silhouette, tall, with long, ragged clothes. The figure didn't move. It just stood there in the doorway, staring at me with hollow eyes. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. My pulse raced. I was frozen, unable to move, my mind screaming at me to drive away, to get the hell out of there. But my feet wouldn't respond. And then, like some sort of nightmare, the figure began to move. It wasn't walking. It was gliding, silently, unnaturally. Each step was smooth, almost fluid, like it wasn't bound by the physical world. It came closer to the edge of the road, and I could see its face, pale and gaunt, with deep, hollow eyes that seemed to sink into the shadows. The voice echoed in my head again, the warning from the old man, "Don't go past the church." I knew in that moment I had made a terrible mistake. Before I could react, the car sputtered, the engine cutting out with a violent jolt. My heart leaped into my throat as the headlights flickered and died. I was left in total darkness, alone, with only the sound of my breathing and the distant rustle of the trees. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I was completely stranded. I looked up, and the figure was standing right in front of the car now, just inches away. I could feel its presence pressing in on me, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey me. The figure leaned down, its breath cold against the glass, and whispered, "You shouldn't have come." The air around me grew icy, and the car seemed to shake. I could hear the faint sound of church bells ringing in the distance, but they were wrong, off-key, distorted, like a funeral dirge. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, everything stopped. The figure vanished. The air returned to normal, and the church stood silent and still once more. I don't know how I managed to start the car, but I did. The engine roared back to life, and I floored the accelerator. I didn't look back. I didn't even stop to check the church again. I just drove faster than I had ever driven before until I finally made it to the cabin. But even now, weeks later, I can still feel it. The chill in the air, the heavy silence that surrounded me, and the whisper of that ghostly figure warning me. And sometimes when I drive through desolate areas, I can still see the shadow of that church in my rearview mirror as though it's waiting for me to come back. Get ready for more spooky stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
Next story.
I wasn't always one to believe in ghost stories. I was a practical person, someone who preferred logical explanations for strange occurrences, someone who would brush off rumors of haunted places as mere superstition. But that was before I found myself driving down that old, forgotten highway late one night. It all started when I decided to take a last-minute road trip after a grueling work week. I needed some time alone to clear my head, and I figured driving through the countryside would be the perfect way to do that. I didn't have destination in mind. just the open road and the promise of solitude. I packed some snacks, grabbed my coffee, and hit the road. The first few hours were peaceful. The sun was setting, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and purple, the world bathed in a warm, fading glow. But as darkness began to fall, something felt different. The quiet country roads that had seemed so charming now seemed endless. The trees loomed like shadows, their gnarled branches stretching across the road, making it feel like the world had closed in around me. I had been driving for hours, and there was no sign of civilization. The GPS had long since lost signal, and I wasn't sure where I was anymore. It didn't bother me at first. I didn't mind the isolation. But as the night wore on, a strange unease began to creep in. I told myself it was just the exhaustion from driving alone for so long, but the discomfort wouldn't leave. And then I saw it, the sign. Or rather, the remnants of a sign, half destroyed by years of weather and neglect. It was faded, but I could just make out the word Pine Hill. I didn't recognize the name, but it seemed like a small town. I thought maybe it would have a gas station or a diner where I could stop, stretch my legs, and get a drink. The road led straight to it, or so it seemed. I made the decision to head into Pine Hill, not knowing what to expect, but hoping for a break from the endless road. As I drove deeper into the woods, the road grew narrower and more treacherous. The trees seemed to close in on both sides, blocking out most of the moonlight. The feeling of isolation intensified, and the silence became almost deafening. And I began to wonder if I had made a mistake. But then, up ahead, I saw the glow of lights. The town, if you could even call it that, was just ahead. I pulled into what looked like the center of Pine Hill, but the sight that greeted me made my stomach twist. It was a ghost town. The buildings were old, dilapidated, their windows shattered and boarded up. The streets were empty, save for a few abandoned cars that looked like they hadn't moved in years. The streetlights flickered sporadically, casting an eerie glow across the deserted road. I stopped the car, my heart racing. I felt a wave of dread wash over me, and I almost turned around right then and there. But something about the place drew me in, a strange pull that I couldn't explain. I told myself I'd just take a quick walk around, maybe check out the old diner or the abandoned gas station. Maybe someone would still be around and I could ask for directions. I locked my car and stepped out onto the cracked pavement. The cool night air chilled me to the bone, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was a strange heaviness to the air, as though the entire town was holding its breath. I made my way toward the diner. The sign, Lou's Cafe, hung crookedly above the door. The windows were dirty, but I could still make out the faded shape of the tables inside. It looked like no one had set foot in this place for years. As I got closer to the door, I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps behind me, echoing in the silence. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, but there was no one there. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It's just the wind, I told myself. It's just my imagination. But as I turned back to the door, I noticed something strange. A figure standing in the window. At first, I thought it was just my reflection, but when I looked again, the figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, its face obscured by the dim lighting. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was something wrong about that figure, something that made my blood run cold. Without thinking, I turned and bolted back to my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, and I almost dropped them in my panic. The footsteps behind me were getting closer, but I didn't dare turn around. I could feel them, though, like someone was right there, just inches away. I managed to get into the car and slammed the door shut. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white as I started the engine. I didn't care that the road was winding and narrow. I had to get out of there. But as I backed out of the parking lot, I saw it again. The figure. It was standing in the middle of the road, blocking my path, just a few yards ahead. It was the same figure I had seen in the window, but now I could make out more details. The figure was tall, gaunt, its clothes tattered and old. The face was a blur of shadows, but its eyes, they were what caught me. I couldn't look away from those eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and somehow they seemed to pierce right through me. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I hit the horn, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, and I swerved around the figure, narrowly avoiding it. As I sped past, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure still standing there. But to my horror, the road behind me was empty. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I kept my foot on the gas, driving as fast as I could, desperate to put Pine Hill, and whatever that thing was, behind me. The feeling of being chased, of something just out of sight, never left me. The roads stretched out endlessly before me, and I didn't dare stop until I had crossed into the next town. By the time I found a gas station, I was shaking uncontrollably. I pulled over, my mind still racing. I couldn't make sense of what had happened. Was it real? Had I just imagined it all? I didn't know, but I had to leave. I'll never forget Pine Hill. I'll never forget that figure and those eyes that followed me through the night. And to this day, I don't know what it was or what it wanted. But one thing is certain, I will never take that road again. Feeling spooky? Keep the chills coming by subscribing to our channel for more ghostly stories.
Next story.
I still can't explain what happened that night. It's one of those things that you try to forget, but your mind keeps replaying every detail in vivid, unsettling flashes. This story begins like any other road trip, just a couple of friends heading out to visit an old friend of mine who had moved to a small town on the edge of Texas. It was supposed to be a quick visit, a couple of days at most, but it turned into something none of us will ever forget. It was a hot summer evening when we started our journey. My best friend, Mark, and I packed up the car and set out from our hometown in New Mexico. The plan was simple: take the highway south, stop for gas when needed, maybe grab a bite to eat, and just enjoy the drive. We had the windows rolled down, the music blaring, the open road ahead of us. It was perfect. We were about 3 hours into the trip when we reached a stretch of road that seemed to go on forever, decked with nothing but dry, cracked land on both sides. The road was straight as an arrow, and there wasn't another car in sight. We were about to pass a small, run-down gas station when Mark suddenly slowed the car down. "Hey, you see that?" Mark asked, pointing off into the distance. I squinted into the setting sun and saw what he was talking about. A small figure standing on the side of the road, far enough that we could barely make it out. It looked like a woman, but the way she stood there, motionless, unmoving, almost like she was waiting for something, gave me a chill. "I don't know, man," I replied. "It's getting late. Maybe we should keep going." But Mark wasn't one to ignore strange things. "I'm just going to check it out. Maybe she needs help or something." I didn't want to argue with him, so I just stayed in the car while Mark pulled off to the side of the road. I watched as he slowly got out and walked toward the woman, who hadn't budged an inch since we first saw her. She was wearing a long white dress, which was strange considering how hot it was. Her hair was long and dark, and her back was to us. I didn't like it. There was something unsettling about the entire situation, but Mark seemed determined. After a minute, I rolled down my window, calling out to him, "Mark, be careful, man. Something's off about this." But Mark didn't respond. He was too far away now, standing next to the woman, just talking to her in low tones that I couldn't hear. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, watching them intently. That's when I noticed something strange. There was no movement in the air. No rustling of leaves, no bugs flying around. The entire scene seemed frozen, still as death. After what felt like an eternity, Mark turned around and started walking back to the car, his face pale. His eyes were wide, his hands trembling slightly as he reached the door. "Dude, what's wrong?" I asked, my voice tinged with concern. Mark didn't answer right away. He just looked at me with a strange, almost fearful look in his eyes. "There's something wrong with her, man," he said quietly, shaking his head. She doesn't look right." "Did she need help?" I pressed, feeling the urge to drive away from this place. Mark hesitated before answering, his eyes flickering back to the spot where the woman had been. "I don't know. I tried talking to her, but she wouldn't say anything. She just stood there, staring at me. I swear, her eyes were completely black, like there was nothing inside, like she wasn't even human." I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about his voice made me uncomfortable, like he was trying to make sense of something that didn't have an explanation. "We need to go," I said, starting the engine and glancing nervously in the rearview mirror. "Now." But as I started to pull away, something strange happened. The woman was gone. I hadn't seen her move, but now she wasn't by the side of the road anymore. My heart skipped a beat. Where the hell did she go? I muttered, my hands tightening on the wheel. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Mark was staring out of the passenger window, his face pale. I don't know, that's not normal. There was no way she could have just disappeared like that. I accelerated, eager to put as much distance as I could between us and that strange encounter. The road stretched on, but it felt like something was following us, something just beyond the edge of the headlights. We didn't talk much after that. The silence between us was suffocating, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the air grew heavier, colder. My headlights caught something in the distance. Just a flash, but it was there. The woman. I slammed on the rakes, but before I could say anything, Mark was already reaching for the door handle, his face twisted in terror. "Don't get out of the car," I screamed, but it was too late. Mark was already running toward the figure again. I could hear him shouting something, but I couldn't make it out. I was frozen, my body paralyzed in fear as I watched him disappear into the darkness. Then, the screaming started. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, like nails on a chalkboard, only sharper, louder. The woman's voice, or whatever it was, echoing across the open road. It pierced through my mind like a blade, and I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. I couldn't bring myself to look away from where Mark had gone. After a long moment, I forced myself to step out of the car, my legs shaking uncontrollably. There was no sign of him. Nothing. I called out his name, Lay, but my voice was swallowed by the vast emptiness around me. I searched the darkened fields, walking, stumbling, hoping to hear something, anything. But there was nothing, just the sound of the wind and the endless silence. I don't know how long I looked for him. Hours, maybe. By the time I finally gave up, I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. My mind was racing with questions, with horror, but I couldn't make sense of it. What had happened to Mark? What was that woman? And why had she disappeared? I eventually made my way back to the car, shaking and sobbing uncontrollably. I drove away from that place without looking back, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, my hands still trembling on the wheel. It's been months since that night, and I still can't explain it. I've asked around, tried to find any information about that stretch of road, but no one seems to know anything about it. And as for Mark, I never heard from him again. No calls, no texts. It's like he vanished off the face of the earth. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I hear a voice calling my name.